Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I was just going to make one note in case you were looking at the events page. We had one guest, one panelist, Sheila, that was unable to attend, and we're just rescheduling her visit, so hopefully she will come and join us in the future. But it's really a great pleasure to introduce first Smith Auma, who's a research fellow at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Smith Auma, Dr. Auma, is a lawyer, and he really approaches this work from an interdisciplinary background. He began his work with Slum Dwellers International as a lawyer, working pro bono on land cases, and more recently supports them in a variety of ways as a researcher, fundraising, professional support. He also works with Professor Diana Mitlin. Many of you may have read her books and her articles, also at the University of Manchester, who is the CEO of the African Cities Research Consortium, which is a huge multi-year project involving many cities. And Smith led the informal settlements. There's different domains, different parts of that work. Some of it focuses on different topics, but Smith led the work on informal settlements in seven African cities. And also, if you're a podcast person, he's done this wonderful podcast called African Cities. It's full of information. I've listened to many episodes. It's really, really amazing. Sites and services, many of the issues and topics you hear today are covered in that podcast, so I encourage you to look up African Cities wherever you get your podcasts. Elman Banco is a postdoctoral fellow with the Cornell Muijo Center for Cities. His dissertation research was on informal workers. Informal workers often live in informal settlements, so today he'll talk more about his informal settlements work, everyday urbanism, and his work is mostly focused on Zimbabwe, Harare, and Accra in Ghana. And both of them will talk about informal settlements. And for those of you maybe who don't know a lot about informality and informal settlements, I often, when I give a lecture on it, I talk about the fact that maybe estimates are always difficult, right? When you talk about informality and you talk about data, the data is always unclear, right? That's part of what's inherent in it, right? It's informal. It's not super well documented. It often exists underneath the radar of the state in places that are hard to enumerate, hard to collect data. So that's why the numbers are a little imprecise. But in global South cities in developing countries, we often say that between 1 in 5 or 1 in 8 residents in those cities lives in an informal settlement, just to give you a sense of the scale and scope of this. And informality means different things in different country contexts. For example, when I worked with many international colleagues in DC, I would talk about informality in Southeast Asia and how informal residents would pay taxes, would pay property taxes. And my colleagues from India thought that was so strange. How could you be informal if you're paying property taxes? Well, you don't have a land title, but they're still collecting property taxes for you. So it's just a very diverse, large universe of diverse practices and forms that it takes in the built environment. So just to kind of give you a sense of that. And I was talking to Elman before we started about, what do you mean by everyday urbanism? Tell me what you mean. And he was saying, it's the people surviving, what they do to survive in very tight circumstances. And in a sense, informal settlements to me are everyday urbanism, because often it's the dominant urban form. It's the way most people in many cities that I work, it's the way that they live. Their houses are self-built. They may not have publicly provided access to all the services that one might expect in the global north: water, sanitation, electricity. So anyway, I think of informal settlements as everyday urbanism. So the structure of today, and I'm going to be a strict timekeeper, is Professor Smith Auma, or Dr. Smith Auma, will present for 15 minutes. Then Elman will present for 15 minutes. Then I will ask them questions for 15 minutes, and we'll open it up for question and answer, and we'll be done by 1:30 today. Thank you. So Smith, please.
Thank you, Victoria, for the very warm introductions. I hope you can all hear me all right. Great. My name is Smith Auma. I'm a research fellow at the University of Manchester in England, not New Hampshire. I've been working with the African Cities Research Consortium, which is a 6-year Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office funded project working across 12 African cities. And I was working particularly with the informal settlements domain, looking at the politics of informal settlements and the political economy of service provision across informal settlements in 7 African cities. So before this, I'd already been collaborating with colleagues, particularly in Nairobi, colleagues working with the Slum Dwellers International, which is a multinational slum dwellers movement across 33 countries globally. So I was working with them primarily on issues around land and trying to look at the political economy, the politics and political economy of land provision across informal settlements in Nairobi. And the understanding here was that land is a primary driver to the marginalization or the marginality that we see across different informal settlements. And access to land is critical in ensuring that residents of informal settlements are able to access services like water, sanitation, and also to access improved housing. So we've been working together trying to look at how the mechanisms are the modalities through which residents of these informal settlements can expand their access to land in the city. So, but along the way, we realized that there are a lot of gaps, and Victoria alluded to this in her introduction, that there are many gaps when it comes to data, and these also include data on land ownership in informal settlements. And the result of this is that there's many contestations, overlapping interests between different actors, which generates a lot of conflicts across informal settlements contexts. So we realize that it's important to try to map out and understand land ownership dynamics across informal settlements in Nairobi by trying to build the data that will be necessary for residents of these informal settlements to be able to, ground their claims on solid data and that they could use to engage with the state and state agencies. So I mentioned before the work we've done under the African Cities Research Consortium. And the idea here was to look at urban politics and the politics of provision across 7 African cities. And from this, we got this understanding around how elite interests manifest across these different cities. Interests in the control of land by elites, control of businesses, and also access to basic services in informal settlements, that political elites, both at the national, city, and settlement level, hold keen interests or key interests in the provision of services and other amenities across different informal settlements. We're able to also see how the politics of public neglect features across these different cities, that in many cases, there are no proper policy frameworks that have been put in place to address some of these challenges that we are seeing across these cities. But within these spaces as well, residents of informal settlements have devised what we call modalities of collective action that they use to push back against this neglect, against these exclusionary practices by the state. And they do this on their own at an individual level, but also collectively within their settlements, and also together with other actors that are located outside their settlements. So we've seen residents of informal settlements work together with reform coalitions to try to propose solutions to some of the challenges that feature across these informal settlements. So the strategies for collective action by residents have grown in scale and sophistication across these different cities. And this is something that we also similarly see in Nairobi. But just to give us an overview of what the challenge is around land and land data in informal settlements, we see that, these are some images of one informal settlement in Nairobi, the Mathare informal settlements. And up there we can see an image of site that was recently cleared. Forceful eviction was carried out by the state to clear off this space. And then we also see some images down there of what the slum looks like. And we see different types of housing typologies, where we see some high-rise buildings starting to crop up in these settlements. And we also see new neighborhoods in this other image here, the new neighborhoods slowly pushing, getting established in these spaces that have historically been occupied by informal settlements. So there is some very strong competition for land across these settlements, and there are ongoing pressures on the land that is held by informal settlements residents. And what we establish is that residents of these informal settlements are not adequately equipped to push back against these pressures that their settlements are facing. Because with these new kinds of establishments, when this happens, the residents end up getting displaced from the spaces that they've historically occupied. And we also realize that this occurs because a lot of these settlements, a lot of residents of these informal settlements are not adequately equipped with the land data that they are able to use to push back against issues of forced eviction and also grabbing of land by well-connected political elites. So the work that has been ongoing in this settlement has tried to equip the communities here with the necessary tools, with the necessary data that they can use to build a stronger case to push back against these practices that create displacements within their settlements. So these settlements are sites of overlapping and competing interests between different actors. One, the residents themselves who occupy these spaces, and also other interests that are often located outside these settlements. And all these claims are in relation to the land within the informal settlements. But actors in these settlements are also differently positioned with regards to their ability to access land data, because accessing this data is important whenever they want to, whenever residents of informal settlements want to push back against these external pressures. But residents find themselves being located in, at a disadvantage here, because their inability to access land data means they cannot put a strong case, they cannot build a case that they can push back against these practices or these forceful evictions. So what we've seen here is that residents of informal settlements are not only physically marginalized, but they are also virtually marginalized, because the land information systems that exist in Nairobi are inaccessible to this group, and they are unable to access the requisite information that they can use to build a case against forceful evictions. So residents have devised strategies to try to collect this data. They've devised strategies to try to collect this data that they can now use to, approach institutions like the National Land Commission, to approach judicial institutions to be able to claim their stake within these settlements. So within the land information systems that we find in Kenya, we have these structural constraints that, first of all, within these settlements, we find multiple overlapping and competing interests. We have residents themselves who have an interest in the land that they occupy. Then oftentimes there will be somebody who comes to these settlements to build a structure that will be occupied by residents of informal settlements. Those also have a claim to the land there. The state, in some cases, also has claims to certain parcels of land within the informal settlement. So all these claims that we see are competing. And in the end, ultimately, the residents of informal settlements are often placed at a disadvantage because of their lack of, inability to access data, and also lack of resources to be able to front their claims. Then we also have, land institutions that are opaque in nature. So anytime an eviction occurs within these informal settlements, it's very difficult for residents to, push back against these claims because they do not know who the perpetrators of these evictions are, because they also do not know who the registered proprietors of these parcels of land are. So it becomes very difficult to even institute litigation against the perpetrators of forceful eviction within these settlements. And whenever residents try to access this information information about who owns the lands that they occupy or who owns the lands where these evictions have been carried out, it becomes very costly to access this information because the registries are very expensive to access. You have to pay to access any kind of land data, and the systems have been designed in a way that they are only meant to facilitate transactions, right? They're only meant to facilitate transactions between sellers and buyers of lands. They have not been designed as systems that individuals can go and access information. So the land registries are very inaccessible and opaque, making it very difficult for residents to be able to access information that will be useful in their claims. So residents have explored different mechanisms to try to push back and to generate information that they can use to secure their claims and interests within these settlements. And all these can be looked at through the lens of data justice, where residents try to put in place mechanisms to remove themselves from those informational peripheries that we've seen. So there are different practices that residents engage in, and all these can be collectively termed as assemblages. So residents are trying to assemble land information and to create alternative land information systems that they can use to document their claims and interests in land in the settlements. So data justice has been seen within these informal settlements as a field of action that residents can use to solidify their stakes within the settlements. So we see residents putting in place or adopting different methodologies to assemble data on land within their settlements. And they do this primarily working with social movements like Slum Dwellers International. So there is ongoing work in two of the informal settlements in Nairobi, that is Mathare and Mukuru, where residents have resorted to building their own land databases, right? Given the realization that, the state-held land information systems are inaccessible and opaque, residents have decided that they are going to build their own land information systems. And the difference between these systems that residents are trying to construct in these two informal settlements with that is kept by the state is that these land information systems that these residents are trying to construct try to account for the multiple range of interests that subsist within an informal settlement context. Because within informal settlements, we have different actors having different types of interests, but oftentimes these interests will not be captured or will not be captured by the registers that are kept by the state, because the state will often capture ownership interests in the land registers that it keeps. But within informal settlements, ownership is not the only kind of interest that subsists. There are individuals that have claim access rights, right? There are individuals that have other interests that do not take the form of ownership interests. So these registers that residents are trying to build try to account for the range of interests that subsist within informal settlements contexts. And residents here are trying to build alternative possibilities for data and also trying to restructure the orders of knowledge and orders of value that we see within the city. That the order of value that the state-led or the state-held land registries try to endorse are a system that values ownership more than other interests that will perhaps subsist within an informal settlement context. So residents are pushing back by saying that there are other interests within these settlements that go beyond ownership, and all these are legitimate interests that must be accounted for within any land information system. So These practices that we see across these two informal settlements can be read as a form of insurgent data-making practices by residents who've been excluded from, state-held land information systems. And this insurgent data infrastructure can be used to expand, rights to citizenships by residents of these informal settlements contexts. So these are all strategies that residents use to push back against the physical and virtual marginalization that feature within these informal settlements contexts. So it is important to support these kinds of initiatives by communities, because local communities living within these informal settlements are best placed to capture the different land dynamics that feature within their settlements. They are able to account for the different interests in land that feature within their settlements, and the construction of these registers can also help them address some of the land conflicts and disputes that we see featuring within these informal settlements context, by making sure that land information is democratized and accessible to low income and marginalized groups in the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Elmont, and I'm a postdoc with the Center for Cities in the Department of City and Regional Planning. And my talk today focuses on building the city from below, looking at the role of urban social movements and their influence in urban transformation in Harare, Zimbabwe, where I come from. And this is a talk that is based on different kinds of research that I've conducted within Harare's informal settlements, and also based on my experience with the Harare slum-upgrading project that was implemented from 2010 to 2015, and I was part of the team that did the end of project evaluation. So when you think about planning and urban development in its technical sense, especially in the global north, you think that planning is largely practiced by licensed planners and planning institutions like your municipal authorities. But here I want to demonstrate that in the context where the capacity of the municipalities is limited, where institutions and policies are exclusionary, residents can also play a very significant role in terms of planning and transforming urban spaces. So just a little bit of some context. For those that are not familiar with Harare, it is the capital city of Zimbabwe, which is located in Southern Africa. Like most cities in Africa, it is experiencing rapid urbanization and population growth. And this has kind of put pressure on the municipality in terms of providing for infrastructure and providing basic urban services. And currently the city faces a serious infrastructure crisis, and its ability to provide basic urban services is evident in different marginalized neighborhoods. And that institutional capacity is also been combined with the rigid and inflexible nature of planning instruments. As a post-colonial city, because Zimbabwe is a British colony, so the post-colonial city administration did not do much in terms of revising the existing urban planning instruments. There's a rigid, and inflexibility, and which are kind of rooted in these colonial logics of exclusion and marginalization. So that has triggered the emergence of urban social movements, especially in beginning early 2000, where citizens were actually laying claims to urban infrastructure and doing their own things to build their neighborhoods and provide for themselves. And what I'm going to share with you, our experience is based on the work that has been done by the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation, which is an affiliate of Slum Dwellers International in Zimbabwe, working closely with our Dialogue on Shelter, which is a local NGO that provides technical planning support to that Federation of the Urban Poor. And sometimes under the Harare Slum Upgrading Project, they work together with the city, as I will demonstrate later on. So the rise of urban social movements, particularly in the context of housing and infrastructure delivery in Harare, has many different layers and characteristics. And the goal really is to where citizens are taking charge of their own inclusion, right? To be part of the city, to become active agents of urban transformation. There have been a lot of, bottom-up remaking Harare, which has happened, which I will demonstrate, where residents self-organize themselves, those living in informal settlements, putting resources together, putting finances together, sometimes without external support, and really building their neighborhoods, providing services incrementally as a way of sending a message to the city authorities that the hegemonic or dominant way of transforming and planning urban spaces sometimes may not work. And there are also alternative urban futures that we need to think about, because that's the reality of informality. It's a reality that we have to live with. And they're also demonstrating that they can actually contribute to making the cities through their own initiatives, no matter how transient, no matter how trivial in the context of thinking about, do this meet the sustainability or do this meet the standards that are expected by planning institutions. So the social movements that I'm talking about, especially the housing cooperatives and the Federation of the Urban Poor, they use different strategies to engage with the city authorities, or different strategies. And one of the things they do is related to what Smith talked about in terms of insurgent data making, right? Through community-based enumerations. There've been a lot of debate around, there's limited data on informal settlements. That's why, cities are struggling to come up with interventions to transform the living conditions in these neighborhoods. But slum dwellers have, demonstrated their ability to actually conduct and produce credible slum profiles, like what the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation did in 2014, when they produced the first ever report on Harare slums profile, which documented the infrastructure conditions, the level of service delivery, the level of deprivation, the social and economic dimensions in the different informal settlements. And they mapped out 63 informal settlements in Harare. And for a very long time, the municipal administration and the planners in Harare, they didn't acknowledge the existence of slums in the city. And they thought that slums are a reality in other African countries or in other cities in the developing world. But the citizens themselves have been able to demonstrate that, and actually using that as a tool for advocacy and challenging and engaging with the city officials in terms of what needs to be transformed, what needs to change within these communities. They've also used negotiations with urban officials, both state and urban officials. And the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation is a very vocal movement. They have been, very instrumental, even when the country's housing policy, Zimbabwe's housing policy, was designed in 2012 and then revised again into the human settlements policy recently, in terms of advocating for land tenure security, advocating for issues around infrastructure improvements in the informal settlements. They also do demonstrations with alternative infrastructures. I will demonstrate later on what that means in terms of thinking about when we think about a city, when we think about water and sanitation, we think about this conventional infrastructure, which is reticulated in the pipes and so forth. But these people have also demonstrated that in the context of slums, where there is no reticulated water and sanitation, there could also be alternatives that may be used in place of the traditional infrastructure that we all know. And these are some of the images that those spatial plans have been co-produced between the city and residents of Epworth, which is kind of an informal settlement in metropolitan Harare, working together to think about what kind of settlement do they want. And residents were actually very, very actively involved in that process. And what the Dialogue on Shelter, working together with the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation, try to do is to build the capacity of what I would call community planners, where you have people that are actually knowledgeable, about planning issues, but not in a technical sense, but they understand the basics. Through, they also do exchange visits to different cities as a way of knowledge sharing, and then they kind of use those lessons to advocate and lobby and engage with the city officials. And there's a lot of incremental housing developments that take place in most of these communities around Harare. As you can see, it's building a neighborhood step by step, based on what is already existing, right? Existing building materials, until you get to to have a permanent housing. They also collectively mobilize resources, both financial and material, to meet the housing needs infrastructure. I want to give you an example. Headcliff Extension is one of the slum communities, which is located on the northern side of Harare. What they do is they have a development committee within the neighborhood. And then they always think about how can we collectively come together and transform our neighborhood. They contribute money. They say, well, we want to put up electricity. Each household has to contribute so much dollars. We want to put up water infrastructure. And the same has happened in other slum neighborhoods, such as Hopley, where residents, no matter how small, they try to do incremental development in terms of their house. And this incremental housing development was actually a policy pronouncement by the government as a result of the advocacy and the active advocacy and active engagement of the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation, working together with the Dialogue on Shelter to think about how can we make our housing policy responsive to the realities on the ground. So when we talk about incremental housing, traditionally, the approach was that before people settle into a community, there have to be infrastructure, there have to be reticulated water and sanitation, so those rigid standards. But incremental and parallel development says you can develop the infrastructure in situ when people are already there. You don't have to displace them. So this is a result of some of the advocacy work that has been going on. They're also contributing more to the material transformation of the urban environment. It's saying that we are part of the city, we have a voice, we need to contribute, and we have to build our city together. And I want to move to the case study that I briefly mentioned, the Harare slum-upgrading project. This was supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as part of their global municipal governance, focusing on inclusive urban development. Implemented in Zivarasekwa Extension, one of the slum, which used to be a holding camp for people that were displaced by forced evictions in 2005. So the Zimbabwe Homeless People's Federation, Dialogue on Shelter, and the city of Harare came up with a memorandum of understanding to say the city provided the land and say, this is where the people are staying, and it's gonna be a collaborative project where people work together. The first thing that they did was to define and identify slums through their slum profiling, right? Which resulted in a slum profiles report documenting the different social, economic, and spatial characteristics in the neighborhood as a way of identifying areas that needed attention. It was largely a collaborative project engaging the poor in terms of the upgrading process, where the poor were actively involved, not just in meetings and decision-making, but in doing the actual work of infrastructure installation. There are also innovative planning platforms and alternative financing models. There was what was called the Harare Slum Upgrading Finance Facility, where the city contributed some money, and then the Gates Foundation also did, as well as the Dialogue on Shelter, where people could actually also contribute as part of a revolving fund. You could borrow that money, not just to do housing improvements, but also to engage in economic activities, maybe running your business and so forth. And this has been celebrated as a very good example on how to do in situ slum upgrading. I think at some point they actually won an award at the World Habitat Forum, which celebrated the way it was designed and implemented and the way it demonstrated impact within the city. So there are a number of good achievements that were realized from the Harare Slum Upgrading Project. It actually improved access to infrastructure and enhanced land tenure security for people that were always living in limbo and worrying about the risks of evictions. It also improved state-society relations because during that time, there was a very close relationship between the city and the Slum Dwellers Federation and local NGOs that were supporting this process. And it also demonstrated that planning instruments and planning frameworks can actually be adjusted to suit the reality. And there were a number of changes that were actually done where planners were meeting with the community and discussing about what should change in terms of the municipal bylaws when we want to accommodate this kind of infrastructure. What are some of the reforms that we need to implement so that we can make this process responsive to what these people are coming up in terms of innovations when it comes to infrastructure delivery? There was also an issue of empowerment. I think, I only have 1 minute left. I think this is just showing the transformation that has happened from precarious housing to decent shelter. And then alternative infrastructure I talked about, like this is just disrupting the conventional understanding of infrastructure or housing and where people can build using different models. So there were key lessons that I want to highlight. The first one is that planning itself is not just a preserve of the planning institutions as we know it. Citizens and non-governmental organizations can also play a role in building the city from below. Citizen participation is very critical when we want to ensure sustainability and ownership of the processes that we're doing. Inclusive city governance is also a prerequisite. There's need for political will and commitment to make this process successful. Thank you so much. I think one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that social movements are becoming very active in terms of planning and urban transformation, not just in Harare, but in most global South cities, including in Asia and Latin America. Thank you so much.
What a nice combination of two presentations that really complemented each other. So before I ask my questions, I'm just gonna bring out some points that really stood out to me. And I don't think had you met before this panel? They had not met before and they had not coordinated their presentations, but to me, they fit together very nicely. Things that I took away from it was just how capable people at the local level are, that residents can organize alternative land administration systems. Residents are capable of building their own homes. They're capable of alternative infrastructure systems, which I have a couple of questions about. And alternative infrastructure, alternative sanitation. They're capable of restructuring planning processes and making them more flexible. And so you get a very strong sense of local agency from both of these talks, that people are capable of doing a lot of the things that we teach in planning school, that local residents are capable of doing it, the civil society community is there to support them. And so a lot of my questions have to do about, let's see if I can find a way to articulate it. Because I myself in my own research was also very interested in community-based planning, questions of collective action, where were the limits of what communities could accomplish. And so I've often been sort of intrigued in this context of a lot of capacity and a lot of local agency, where is the role for the state? And what things is the state in a better position maybe to provide? And what things are communities and civil society maybe in a better position to provide? And let me articulate my question even in more detail in anticipation of what I think maybe some of the answers would be. I think that sometimes it's a tricky thing, right? Because in a sense, in a lot of these cities, communities are stepping up because in the absence of providing those services, they wouldn't exist. They would have to walk further for water. The sanitation outcomes that would happen would be less pleasant in their immediate environment. So in the absence of having those things, residents get organized, they find a way, they become very creative. But I guess it's that tension between celebrating that and valorizing that and saying, wait a second, cities are becoming increasingly dense, complicated built environments. And we also know that when residents provide for themselves, that creates unintended consequences, inefficiencies. Things can become even more expensive. We hear about the poverty penalty that poor people pay for services. And if you were to have them organized at a higher level by a public entity, but in the absence of that, there becomes this strange tension for me between valorizing these kind of local things. Okay, so that's kind of what I take away from both of these talks and sort of the question. But let me ask you some very specific, almost sort of technical questions. So last summer, we were actually in Accra, and we did a workshop about housing and informality and services. And everywhere I go in the Global South, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in Nairobi, whether it's in Accra, we have these workshops, and you start to talk to people about land tenure and the systems of documenting land ownership and rights to land. And it's almost as though people throw their hands up. They're like, we're going to have to get the chiefs involved. It's going to be complicated. We're never going to figure out. And that sort of, to me, seemed like a little bit of beauty with the SPA, with Makuru and Nairobi, that it sort of almost seemed to freeze people. So this is the special planning area in Nairobi that I'm referring to, where you had an informal settlement and you had I think it was a 2-year moratorium on forced evictions, and it sort of froze people in time and allowed them to engage in a participatory planning process. And I was just wondering if you, because I understand the desire for residents, like, God, what a beautiful thing, right? To create a transparent land administration system that doesn't cost a lot of money and maybe could be like open access, right? Like anybody could look in there and see. But I was wondering, does that solve the problem of like the multiple layers of this is the pre-colonial period, because Southeast Asia. Then we have the colonial land tenure. Then you have the people that have come in after independence and think they have rights to land. And then the people that have kind of taken or done land grabs on top of that. How do you, even in creating that administrative system that's created by local people, how do you resolve those rights issues? That, please.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Victoria, and thanks, Edmund. I think I will start by also just acknowledging that, it's important not to valorize these self-help mechanisms too much, while forgetting that the state has a role to play in, first, the production of these issues that we talk about, the marginalization that we're talking about here, the injustices that that these residents talk about. The state has a main role to play in creating them. The state is deeply implicated in the creation of these problems. But then the state is also an indispensable actor in these spaces, because oftentimes the state will have a positive legal obligation to make provisions for housing, for basic services. So all this are an acknowledgement that the state has an important role to play, right? The state also is critical in conferring recognition, because a lot of the issues that we see across different informal settlements are questions of recognition of different kinds and different levels of citizenship. That there are some people within the city or within a state who will have, citizenship in the way that we traditionally know it, that is national citizenship, but they will be disqualified from a different level of citizenship, which is an urban kind of citizenship, the ability to enjoy rights to the city, rights in the city. So the state is an important actor which has to be engaged in all these processes. When it comes to these kinds of interventions, like the land registers that the communities are trying to create, whether they acknowledge the range of interests that exist in an informal settlements, and whether they are likely to contribute to, creating more problems. I think there's a real danger here that, these kinds of interventions can also generate more problems, right? Because, once you start adjudicating interests, because when you start creating a database, documenting different interests in land. That is basically an adjudication process. You're basically identifying who has rights and who doesn't. It is a process of including and exclusion at the same time, right? So with the complicated nature of interests in informal settlements, there's a likelihood that there's some groups that will still be excluded from these processes and from these platforms. So it is important that these are truly democratic processes, processes that are put in the hands of the communities themselves at the very local level, at that very lowest level, the settlement level, and that safeguards are also put in place to ensure that these tools and these interventions do not create more exclusion. And making them accessible, openly accessible, could be one way, but this should also be done while acknowledging the political economy at the settlement level. Because sometimes within this informal settlements contexts, there is a need to make certain things invisible, right? Informal settlements have a challenge of being rendered invisible. The data gaps that we're talking about here are, the product of the state making these spaces invisible, right? So oftentimes, residents will try to make themselves visible by doing enumerations, by constructing their own land databases. But there's some levels of invisibility that may be required in these spaces, because some sense of visibility may bring about some negative or detrimental consequences to the residents, right? It may invite more cases of forced evictions. It may invite actors to, unlawfully acquire land. So it is a process that has to be very carefully navigated, considering the politics at the settlement level and, the different political dynamics. But the idea is that putting these tools in the hands of the community, of the residents at the settlement level, will make these instruments and these resources more democratic, and will perhaps lead to, will reduce the cases that we see of forced evictions, of, unlawful acquisition of land by external actors in informal settlements, etc. But having said that, there still remains challenges that, requires a lot of considerations.
Along the same lines, Mike, and I'm only going to ask one question for each person so we can open it up for the audience and have time for some questions from the audience. So it was interesting to me, Elman, that you talked about alternative infrastructure. So I've worked on alternative infrastructure, and the first example you gave, I think, was alternative sanitation, which to me, as alternative infrastructures goes, is one of the most complicated, especially when you're thinking about the management of human waste. And so I was just wondering if you could, and I realize it's kind of a technical question, if you could say anything about different types of alternative infrastructures and which ones it seems the communities are maybe in better position to handle, and which ones seem to have more risks, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. That's a very critical question. And I want to emphasize one of the things you said about avoiding the danger of romanticizing self-provisioning of infrastructure, because there are still very significant issues that we need to consider when you look at sustainability of those interventions. When we look at issues to do with, I think you talk about public health risks. Under the Harare slum-upgrading project, I think through the exchange visits that these communities were doing, they went to Namibia, and then there was a model of what is called an ecological sanitation facility, which is kind of an alternative sanitation facility, an alternative toilet that is not the typical reticulated. So what it works is there's a kind of indigenous and traditional ways of, how it's designed with ash and putting ash in the pit and all that, so that it doesn't really create problems when it comes to managing human excreta. But there's also dangers associated with because some of the communities, for instance, in Harare, Hopley, which is a big informal settlement, most residents actually use Blair toilets. And some of these Blair toilets are located very close to the wells that they use to get water, and that raises questions around exposure to waterborne diseases such as cholera and the likes. So it's really a delicate balance in terms of thinking about the innovations that could work in these communities, but without causing exposure to public health risks. So it's, there's need for more research, thinking about what kind of infrastructure when it comes to sanitation that could actually be sustainable with less risks to the communities themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Jing, did you want to, we're going to open it up. Oh. For questions, if you want to raise your hand really high so Ding can see you. Yeah. Carlos, I see a question.
Hi, my name is Medha. Thank you so much for the talk. My question is specifically for in the case of Nairobi, because I got to visit Mathare and Mukuru last semester for a studio that I took. So I know that SDI has played a role in mobilizing the community members using collective action to conduct enumerations and then use that to make claims to the county government and achieve recognition and the SPA status, as Professor Victoria mentioned. So my question is, what exactly does this SPA status mean for the future of that particular community? And what is SDI's role beyond this? Does it act as a mediator between the community and the government? And does it leverage its global connections or partnerships for achieving finances to actually develop that infrastructure that's needed?
Why don't we take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then Smith, that would be a good one for you because it's just so specific to Nairobi.
Hi, my name is Marinissa, and I'm a first-year MRP student. I had a question for Professor Almond. He talked about colonial structures and how they had left a setup in place, like institutions in place that were extortive and kind of. I also come from a city that was a colony, and that has a really large informal sector. So I wanted to know how you feel like those structures have played into the current informality in Zimbabwe, and how you feel the state, which is now not a colonial state, which is a state of the people, should work towards battling those colonial institutions to kind of come out of that structure and serve the people instead of extorting.
Okay, maybe one more question. For the SPA and SDI's role.
Thanks for your excellent speech. And I'm a second-year MRP student, and I have a question. As we all know, like in slums areas, all of the residents, they are doing self-organized and bottom-up planning. But sometimes there are the conflicts from top-down planning, like we talk about the political elites and some business development. They were trying to involve into the development of slums, and it will change the landscape of the slums. And some changes are the residents, they don't want to happen those changes, but the changes just happen. So there will be a conflict between the bottom-up planning and top-down planning in slums, and sometimes it's a contradictory. But I have learned a theory that someone said bottom-up planning is not means no planning, means no plans, because it's self-organized, and many people think the slums, there is no planning. They are just some self-organized organizations or communities, and they don't know how to plan their own neighborhood. So that's why some political elites and business developers, they trying to get involved in the slums development. So what do you think about the conflicts between the top-down planning and bottom-up planning around the slums?
Okay, that's a perfect place maybe to end. So I have one for Smith about what is exactly the SPA and the role of SDI.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it Mita? So the SPA basically is a tool that was used to declare this slum or this informal settlement as a special planning area. It is a tool that acknowledges that conventional planning models may sometimes not necessarily work within certain spaces, including informal settlements. So this settlement was declared as a special planning area, triggering some planning interventions from the state and also collectively with the community. So in that case, also just to answer the last question, that's a space where we saw, an intervention that brought together the state and the community to plan for a settlement that had never seen any planning intervention. And the way it was modeled was that the community played a role in designing every aspect that they wanted to design. And ultimately, they presented these proposals to the state, and the state came in to implement some of these proposals. So we've seen cases where community-led planning works, right? I also work with communities in Manchester in the UK, and these communities are also working with the local authority to try to expand provisioning for social housing and other public or community amenities, where the communities themselves work to identify spaces where these kinds of amenities can be established, and then they work together with the state to ensure that these amenities are actually delivered. Right. So there is a democratic imperative to ensure that communities drive these planning processes. So what does SPA status mean for the future of residents of Mukuru? The SPA as an intervention is an intervention that was meant to extend recognition and legal recognition of this settlement that had previously not been recognized by the state. We have tools in other countries, like in India, where we have tools like slum notification that can be used to extend recognition to informal settlements, triggering interventions by the state. So in the Kenyan context, tools like the SPA can be used to trigger that kind of recognition. And once an informal settlement is recognized by the state, then residents are now, better positioned to demand for certain interventions from the state, because this now comes with some legal backing, with some legal, endorsement. So in the long term, this is a settlement that is now recognized by the state, and residents here can now use this tool to petition for the state to bring about these kinds of interventions. SDI's role in this process as, a federation of slum dwellers, it played the role of convening what could be termed as a reform coalition. Yeah, because oftentimes these interventions are developed through collaborations between different actors. The state being a primary actor in these, urban governance processes, communities, civil society organizations, and academics as well. So SDI, Slum Dwellers International Kenya, during this process played the role of being the convener of this reform coalition, right? And its convening role there also meant that community voices could be, could feature along the planning process, because it has the mandate to represent or also to work with communities in these kinds of spaces. So it played the role of bringing together these different institutions to develop this plan, working together with the communities that would ultimately be the beneficiaries of these planning interventions. I hope those answers some of the questions. Thanks.
Thank you. The question of colonial structures is a very big one. I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because yesterday I was doing another talk with the African Institute for African Development, and that question came up. And what I would say is, when you think about planning instruments in the context of Harare, the question of the coloniality of planning does not start at the practice itself. It has to do with the planning education in our country. When I went to the planning school, we were always taught about the model cities of the global north, and sometimes the challenge then comes from how do you plan a city when you are thinking about the philosophy that is underpinning your practice as a planner is based on, we want to see a London, we want to see a New York in a context that is backed by rapid informalization. in Harare specifically, there is a very strong colonial nostalgia. And when you talk to the planners, they always mention the Harare they knew, before independence. And then they want to maintain that city because to them, Harare to be sort of, in brackets, a world-class city, it has to emulate certain standards. But, there are a lot of questions that I have in terms of really thinking about what exactly is a world-class city when you have people that are trying to negotiate, that are trying to navigate the structural constraints. And some people have talked about what is happening in our cities is internal colonization, not just external, colonial legacies. Then the question about bottom-up and top-down, processes of transformation. I think that's a big question. And when you think about it, the question that you have to ask is, what exactly planning? Planning for what? Planning for who? Who defines what planning is? And when you go to these informal settlements, some people have said we can't say they are disorganized because there's a certain level of organization that exists in terms of getting things done. There's a certain level of leadership that exists in terms of organizing themselves and trying to, how decisions are made. And, some people have even coined the term informal planning, like, people plan the way they want to see their neighborhood. So it is up to the institutions themselves to recognize that and try to see how can we make it work, or how can we work together to maybe transform the community in ways that we want to see.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect place to kind of conclude. I want to just say a couple more things. For those of you that are interested, Smith Uma will be with us as a visitor till April 1st. And his office is on the 3rd floor of West Sibley. Which number is it? Is it 3? It's on the 3rd floor. He has his name on the door, so you can find it. It's a very small hallway. And Elman, as a postdoc, is here for this academic year and hopefully through next academic year. So you do have an opportunity to meet with them again. Ding, are we doing a talk back?
Yes, we're doing a talk back in 105 in Sibley. So if you want to come and chat with our speakers informally, please join us.
If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, you can ask it, but please join me in thanking our speakers. Yay!